We are glad to have Joy Masoff, who's a member of our board for many years. She's responsible for all these exhibits. And she's been doing research for how many years?
4 years.
4 years. She's close to a PhD in this. And this topic, Paine and feminists. And she's here to present a very detailed explanation of Paine's associates, female associates, in his lifetime. And it's a hidden area that hasn't been explained, and she's going to explain it to you now. We'll have questions at the end of the presentation. So wait until her slideshow is done and she's talking, and then ask questions.
Put the phone out, right?
Okay?
All right.
Can you hear me, guys?
Yeah, speak right close to the microphone.
Okay.
You could patch it, and then it's the best.
Hi, everybody. As Gary said, I'm Jill. I've been involved with the Paine Society for quite a few years now. And I am about 6 months out from, I hope, getting a PhD. Either that or I'm going to have to bomb the entire history department of my university. But
Joy needs to be as loud as you can.
as loud as I can. Okay. I originally planned to open this discussion by evoking Aesop's fable, the ass and the purchaser. And the lesson of that is that a man is known by the company he keeps. We can go to the next slide. Thanks. But I went for a walk with my new neighbor the other day, and she's a psychology professor. And I was telling her about this idea of writing about Paine, not about his works, but about who he was hanging out with, who were his friends, and how were they influencing him. And she said, oh, you have to check out Kurt Lewin. He's a famous psychologist. So Lewin was a survivor of Nazi persecution. And the group to which an individual belongs is the ground of his perceptions, his feelings, and his actions. So, as I introduce you to my work, I ask you to think of both that stubborn ass and Lewin's research that proved that you were very, very greatly influenced by who you are hanging around with. And this is a really important way to understand Thomas Paine and one of the most misunderstood founders of this country. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of my dissertation. This is a true story. It's my nephew, who is a Harvard graduate with a PhD in theology, asked about my work a couple of years ago. And I told him I was writing about Thomas Paine, and he said, oh, he's the one who said, give me liberty or give me death. And so the big problem is that US history textbooks present Paine as the right man at the right time in the right place. A sort of larger-than-life character who somehow miraculously dropped onto North America's shores and, a failed corset maker. And somehow or other just intellectually evolved when he got to America and bestowed common sense on an eager public. Just 13 months after he arrived, 250 months ago in January. But it's never that simple, right? So, next slide. So my thesis is that sociability began shaping Paine into a deep thinker long before he set foot in Philadelphia in 1774. The people he surrounded himself with, they influenced his ideology greatly. He went from being just a gifted political polemicist to a humanitarian to a utopian globalist. This is the part of Paine you never hear about. This person who saw the world as one. And it all happened in large part because of who he was hanging out with. And he was involved in many associated circles throughout his life. And you can tell by looking at the next slide, which is, I call my scary slide. And I was going to get up and I'm going to point to the people in the audience. The top row of blue, we start with, he was a staymaker. You all know that. But he was a privateer. He made enough money on his private privateering adventures that he could go to London lectures for 6 months. While he was there, he met George Lewis Scott and Ben Franklin at the Royal Society. I have actually charted a point where George Lewis Scott and Ben Franklin were in the same room multiple times. And then became part of the Junius group. He had mystery patrons. Gary has spoken a lot about that. He was being supported financially. And then he became an excise officer, tax collector, but he really wasn't collecting taxes. He was in a variety of social groups. He came to America. There's his track of boat, journalism, common sense, Declaration of Independence, furious Whigs, politics, whistleblowing, federalism. He goes to England and France, and we are going to be focusing on this area right here. France, England, engineering, the Bastille, and all of the women that now infiltrated his life. So, scary slide. No more slides. I'm just gonna go quickly over this slide. He was in all of these different associative groups. These are groups that he was a member of, groups that he started, again, in Britain before he even came to America, in France heavily, and then back in America again. So, onward. Okay, we get to the meat and potatoes of all the things. So, Paine and the Feminists is one chapter in my entire dissertation, which covers him from birth to death. But he had a unique talent. He could fit himself into all sorts of different group dynamics. That didn't mean that he didn't have fracture points or, a certain degree of rigidity. He could be holier than thou, which backfired spectacularly on several occasions. And his ideas were threatening to the wealthy and powerful. So he was viewed as a contentious figure as a result, and he was not easily pigeonholed or defined, and as a result, his ghost has worn shackles for centuries of derogatory assaults. Because he was fearless in his thinking, he seemed a threat to some, and because he was moody and thin-skinned, he could be deemed difficult. But these 2 centuries of verbal tarring and feathering by his political enemies have somehow become facts, until they've been deemed as just canon truth. One of my favorite quotes is from a very eminent historian named Gordon Wood, who said, "He was slovenly and lazy and described as coarse and uncouth in his manners. His temperament was fiery and passionate, and he loved his liquor and confrontations of all sorts." And I have to say that I did not see that ever. So I am not here to talk about pirates or politicians or historians that have gotten everything wrong. I want to talk about something that is seriously understudied, which is Paine's important connections with many extraordinary women in Great Britain, France, and America. So the problem is with Paine biographers, probably a lot of you are familiar with John Keene's Tom Paine book. It's this big, thick book, everybody's read it. And this was his comment about Paine. He had little interest in women and very few good female friends. In the index of that John Keene book, there are only 10 entries, and none of them about any of these women. Audrey Williamson's Thomas Paine, which is a favorite of Gary's, said that he had occasional encounters with women, but they were anecdotal, or there are really no birth to death studies about his evolving relationship with the opposite sex, or his slow evolution from the embrace of patriarchal hegemony to a growing support for a modicum of women's rights. And so that's what I'm talking about today. So there are 3 main groups. There are a series of British women, and those are in the top left-hand corner. They're Catherine Macaulay, Anna Letitia Barlow, Mary Wollstonecraft, and Helen Maria Williams. Nobody has written about his relationship with Macaulay. Very little about Barlow. There's some work about Mary Wollstonecraft, but those people writing about them didn't like them, honestly, you come away from reading their stuff and you think that Mary Wollstonecraft is the Lady Macbeth, you know, that this distraught histrionic woman, and then Helen Maria Williams, who is fared better in the historical record.
Can you say more about Mary Wollstonecraft?
I'm
not sure.
I'm gonna get into that. I'm gonna get into
Okay.
that. This is just a sort of a brief overview of, you know, of these people. This is in France. All of a sudden, 3 of the women in England factor into what's going on in France. And one American woman, and this British woman, Charlotte Smith. I'm gonna talk about all of these people today, just warning you. And then when he leaves France in 1802 and comes back to America, we have Marguerite Bonneville, who is a specialist in Marguerite Bonneville, and Ruth Barlow and Kitty Few are 3 American women that are really good to talk about. Okay, British women, yay. Paine had a critically important relationship with Macaulay. She was kind of a mentor to him. When he was a young, you know, in the beginning of the Scary Slide with the Julius letters, they developed a relationship. And I think she kind of, Gary, what do you think, trained him a little bit, or?
She wrote one of the first articles that Paine wrote, and she helped.
Yeah, she
That
was,
in the 50s.
yeah, she was like encouraging him.
Yeah.
You know, they could see that he was witty, that he was quick, that he, you know, was very smart. And between Franklin and Scott and Macaulay, you know, and several other people, Priestley and Berg, there was this little group. And so they nurtured him. Mary Wollstonecraft, over here, really, really admired Macaulay. She was the first, she was a historian. She wrote a 6-volume history of England. She was the first printed woman in print, first woman historian that was acknowledged globally. And so they were mentors. Paine shared a publisher with Wollstonecraft and Barbow over here. It was called Joseph Johnson's Society for Constitutional Information. And they met in his office and they would have debates. And that was where Thomas Paine first met Mary Wollstonecraft. And she kind of grabbed the floor from him. He was supposed to be the center of attention at this like night with Thomas Paine. And she just started dominating the conversation. And which was kind of interesting. And also Williams over here, Helen Williams, also attended. So we have Barbow, Williams, and Wollstonecraft are all together in this room with Thomas Paine. And Paine greatly admired Barbow, who was mostly writing poetry at that point. But one of the first things he did when he took over the editorship of the Pennsylvania magazine was to feature a poem of hers called Corsica. So he's like listening to women at this point, you know, mostly because some of them were loud. Mary Wollstonecraft was loud. She fought back against Edmund Burke's takedown of the French Revolution, because she was so angry that when she started writing her rebuttal to it, she was just literally writing pages and handing them to the typesetter. She sat in the printing office and wrote that. Just want to go back a tiny bit. Paine was married briefly. He buried his first wife and stillborn child in 1760. He legally separated from his second wife in 1774, mostly because it had not been a love match. It had been a marriage of friendship and convenience, and her father was his landlord, you know. But he became aware of the laws of coverture, which say that women have no rights. When they get married, they become one with their husband and lose their voices, and that bothered him. But his landlord, Samuel Olive, didn't believe that. He actually treated his daughter equal with his sons, distributed his estate equally, and so that is good to know. So back to Macaulay. Some of the French revolutionaries did not know this, like Jean-Paul Marat, lived in England for 10 years, and he was a great admirer of Macaulay's. And he sort of borrowed some of the passages in his book, The Chains of Slavery, from her. I think he was what's that word when you steal? Steal from somebody else's writing.
Flavorist.
Flavorist, thank you. Anna Letitia Barbeau she was an author, a poet, an editor, a translator, an educator, and she taught at the same school that Jean-Paul Marat taught at. I like to look at these little connections between people. Barbeau's and Paine's paths would cross again when Paine returned to Britain in 1788 to tackle the building of this bridge, which is I'm assuming you people know about the bridge.
There's a picture of it up there.
Yeah, the bridge. He was very, very disenchanted with politics in the US at that point, and had a lifelong love of science and engineering and things of that nature. And he just had enough, went back to use the expertise of French and British ironmongers and engineers to build a bridge to go over the Schuylkill River in Pennsylvania. So we have Mary Wollstonecraft, who is just fearless, and her vindication of the rights of man was the first track of, as I said, I lost my place a little bit, bear with me. Paine was angry about Burke's reflections, but he was busy working on the rights of man part the first, and he was distracted by his bridge, and so Wollstonecraft got the first words out. Helen Maria Williams, who's the pretty woman in the lower right, she was not the only British proto-feminist to cross the channel to France to witness history. And she wrote a series of books called Letters Written in France, and these are just an extraordinary collection if you are their essays, masquerading as dispatches. And she would take readers from joyous celebrations after the fall of the Bastille to intimate visits with fearless female educators. There were women present at the balconies of the Hall of the National Assembly. And so these three women were all admirers, allies of the Girondists, which were a group of French political people who were fighting to end monarchy at that point. And Williams started hosting one of her little social groups called the British Club, which at an Anglo-American hangout in Paris called the White's Hotel. And that was where Paine lived when he first arrived in France. And White's was kind of a home base for Paine. It was a place for him to unwind, and Williams socialized there with Paine and Wollstonecraft and Ruth Barlow, who was the wife of a British baron who renounced his baronetcy. And sometimes the poet William Wadsworth dropped in and was part of this circle, and Wadsworth got a mad crush on Williams. And it's the land of l'amour, I guess. And there are in all these interesting connections going on at this point. Williams wrote of dropping off to see Paine. He moved from the hotel to a house on the Rue Saint-Denis, and she described walking in to say hi to him, and there's a famous French feminist named Véronique de Mercourt, and she was hanging out with Paine. You know, they were just sitting in his salon, and so he was there with these two women. And you know what's really interesting about these connections is nobody's writing anything. You know, nobody had diaries. These people didn't have diaries really, and but you see that Paine is socializing in the intimacy of a private setting. These little small non-public exchanges are so important to what is going on. And there's a parallel in the political messaging of each of these women. And at the same time, Paine's exposure to them was assuredly influencing sections of Rights of Man Part II. And that was a work that placed Paine on a path toward awareness of some of the challenges that many women faced. And it was the first time, as a result, that Paine specifically spoke about creating social welfare programs to benefit women, from young mothers to elderly widows. And it was through his continuing immersion in France's mixed gender social gatherings that his call to action crystallized. This is my favorite slide. These are all the people that were in Paine's life. There was an anonymous female writer, she went by the name Madame B. de B. And she issued a call to action and said, "It is in this moment of general revolution that a woman who is astonished by the silence of her sex, which should have so many things to say, so many abuses to combat, so many grievances to present, dares to finally raise her voice in defense of a common cause." So this is the first time somebody is saying enough, really. And so the question being asked across France for women in the months before and during the revolution is this: why does one sex have everything and the other one nothing? So the women are speaking up. The women played an outsized role throughout the French Revolution. There were the working class pipe-wielding women who marched to Versailles. There were these elaborately coiffed, craftily witty salon women who turned their living rooms into temples of enlightenment thinking. The women were organizing political action groups. They were thoughtful, wishful, fiercely physical on occasion, often loud, but always mindful of their desired goals. So the Enlightenment and the simmerings of revolution in the Atlantic world had planted these seeds of emerging proto-feminist movement. And global upheaval was an accelerant in this fight for gender equality. So Paine was exposed to different kinds of gender interactions compared to his experiences in America. France was a progressive milieu where men and women constantly socialized together, and the time spent with these women broadened Paine's views about what gender parity might look like. Next. I'm gonna come back to this slide. So these are the four main social groups that Paine was a part of. The first was the Société Républicaine, which was started by the Baron Condorcet, and his wife was just an extraordinary woman named Sophie de Boucher. She was an artist, a writer, fluent in English, and they convinced Paine to start a little newspaper called Le Républicain, and Paine edited and wrote for this newspaper. There were only four editions, but he was very, very deeply involved in that. The second group is this one, the Société des Amis de Noir, which was an abolitionist group, and that was headed by Jacques Brissot and his wife, Félicité Dupont Brissot. She too was fluent in English, and so Paine could have conversations with her. The third group is the Cercle Social and Les Amis de la Vérité, and this is a group, a feminist group called Société Patriotique et de Bienfaisance des Amis de la Vérité, which is led by two proto-feminists who we'll talk about, Olympe de Gouges and Etta Palm, who is a Dutch woman. And the fourth group is the Jacobin Club, and I'm sure you all have heard of the Rolands. This is Dagmar and her husband, who was older and an economist and very dull, and so she rewrote everything that he ever wanted to get out. And so all of these groups are having meetings all the time. The Cercle Social, they would get 1,500 people to come to a meeting. Both Madame Roland and Sophie de Gouges had salons in their house. So Thomas Paine is in these groups all the time, surrounded by smart women. These were betterment societies. And so again, he's absorbing, and he does understand French. Very big misconception that he didn't understand the word of French and couldn't speak a word of French. couldn't read French, and that is so not true. He certainly understood everything. He could read everything. He was self-conscious about speaking. He was afraid to not sound as polished as he normally would have liked to. So Paine really liked Sophie Duverger. Can we go back to the last slide?
Yeah.
Thanks. So she's the top left. She translated for him. And when you think about it, if you're writing something and you're trusting somebody to translate your words properly, this is like a very trusting relationship. And she was young and she was pretty and philanthropic, and that was one of his great partnerships. There was a collaborative trust between them. Felicity Dupont, and the one that says Brissot because that's her married name. With her relationship with her husband was kind of fraught. He was ignoring her. He was so busy with politics that she was really struggling and living on the brink of impoverishment. She had 3 children and no help. And that became something for Paine to think about. You know, like, how does a woman whose husband is busy with everything else manage? He very kindly introduced her to Mary Wollstonecraft and had Madame Brissot translate Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women into French. So he's building these networks, he's always making connections. And then Madame Brissot could support herself by translating other English writers into French. And that's what kept her family fed and clothed. And in several annotations to Wollstonecraft's work, Madame Brissot stuck things in. You know, she had annotations in some of it, and one of them was that she was crying for a revolution in female manner through education and social emancipation. Paine, and there's no proof that Paine and Madame Brissot collaborated on anything, but her whole goal, and I kind of think some women maybe feel like this way, but she did not want to be she called it a nudité, a non-entity. And that made her part of all of these conversations that were taking part. Marie-Jeanne Roland, she had a very different view of the revolution and the best ways to make it succeed. She was the daughter of a Parisian engraver. She grew up in a creative household, very, very, very voracious reader, champion of enlightenment thinking, a very, a young woman, very confident in her intellect, married to a guy 20 years older, she started a salon, and Paine and Madame Roland, not such great friends. They had a very sometimes fraught relationship, but their revolutionary sympathies were aligned. And she was actually from Lyon, and they started hanging out at the Jacobin Club, which was a constitutional debating society. And again, the Rolands are now traveling in the same social circles. But she thought she was smarter than most people, and she was very judgmental, and Paine was not exempt from her disdain. She wrote, "I have already named the most notable of the people I entertained, but I must also mention Paine." After pointing to the unfortunate language barriers that separated them, she opined, like so many authors, he was not worth so much as his writings. The daring of his opinions, the originality of his style, his audacious way of casting unpleasant truths in the faces of those he was exposing naturally, caused a great sensation. But I would judge him more adept at setting things alight than preparing the foundations of government. So, she's looking at him like, yes, but I do this, but the salon's been called the cradle of the French Revolution, but behind closed doors, women were orchestrating important conversations also. And so she would sit there and she would just eavesdrop on what everybody was saying, and began to realize that she was smarter than anybody in the room. And she would sit in the corner, not saying anything, writing furiously, biting her lip, in frustration mostly. Women, we all know that. And I'm not sorry. just with this knowledge that she was absorbing the opinions and helping her husband to be able to articulate this, everything to the government leaders. Sophie de Gruchet, up in the top left, also had a salon, and her husband was the Inspector General of the Mint. And Paine was often in attendance. He would meet Adam Smith there. So for the women revolutionaries, the stakes are really, really high at this point, because they're gaining a little traction. You know, in the optimistic years of the early revolution, there was a degree of sisterhood between well-educated and financially comfortable women and those desperately struggling to put food on their families' tables. So there's this homogenizing. And for Paine, this egalitarian revolution is a new experience. You know, he's been growing up in this patriarchal society, you know, where he's only surrounded by men. You think about the American Revolution, other than Abigail Adams, you know, maybe Mercy Otis Warren, can you name any? No. You know, but here we have all of these women, so, you know, these were strong, passionate, opinionated women, and he was forced to listen to them because his debate skills, he was a great debater, but, you know, because he was tongue-tied, he couldn't debate, he could only hear. And that kind of started an evolution of his ideas. As Paine moved in these social circles, the women in the group grew louder, more strident in their protests. There was no more writing poems, no more translating articles, not even producing political pamphlets. They wanted full-throated equality under the law. You know, if the new France was represented by two people, Marianne, a woman, and the law, la loi, which was represented as a woman. And I will point to this woman over here, Marguerite Brazier Bonneville, and that is the portrait that her cousin drew of her as the law. And so that was she was an icon, not in the sense of that, but as a printed icon. And they were starting to ask questions like, why can't we vote? And so that was very, very, very big question at that point. Her husband and she started a group, the Cercle Social, and they invited two women, Olympe de Gouges and Etta Palm, to come and speak. And they were full-fledged feminists, you know, and were really advocating for equality, complete equality. And so Paine, you know, embracing his Mr. Common Sense, persona, saw a lot to applaud in de Gouges' work. This notion of inherent rights, her attacks against oppression, the subjugation of people at the hands of a monarch, compliant aristocracy. And Paine was forced to confront de Gouges' explicit condemnation of man being the only gender worthy of human rights. I mean, I ask that all the time. I don't think we've gone very far. So while all this is going on in the early days of the revolution, Paine is commuting between London and Paris and back and forth until he was permanently exiled from England in September of 1792. And so he knew what was going on. He had met these women. He had been a school teacher for a really brief period at an artisan school for children of both genders. And he knew the power of learning and the elasticity of a young mind. And so as he began writing The Rights of Man, part the second, he amplified the voices of de Gouges and other British proto-feminists, Mary Wollstonecraft and Helen Marie Williams. He's been saying a nation under a well-regulated government should permit none to remain uninstructed. It is monarchical and aristocratical government only that requires ignorance for its support. And again, there's so many parallels. You know, I look at us now, like, oh, we don't went to school. And there was no gender in this time in Paine's demands. Paine's active participation in the Cercle Social offered an opportunity to socialize with Etta Palm, who was a Dutch feminist. She was an active member of this group. And one of the issues at stake was the marital imprisonment of many women. You know, you could be married to an abusive man, and that's too bad. You were stuck. There was no divorce. There was no getting out of anything. You could murder your husband. I guess that's. I've been tempted.
Why did you look at me when you said that? He was murdered. Sorry.
So in his friendship with the Bonnevilles, you know, he started realizing that he had picked this up from Marguerite Bonneville's husband, Nicholas, who was a big feminist, who said that women were half slaves, and they were at that time. So Paine became involved in writing for Bonneville, who was a journalist, had several newspapers, wrote books, and particularly wrote a very good book about marriage and what a conjugal relationship should be. And this is a quote from Etta Palm, the nice, pretty blonde in the, you can find her, second from the left. The prejudices with which our sex has been surrounded, supported by unjust laws which only accord us a secondary existence in society, and which often force us into the humiliating necessity of winning over the cantankerous and ferocious character of a man who, by the greed of those close to us, has become our master. Those prejudices have changed what was for us the sweetest and most saintly of duties, those of wife and mother, into a painful and terrible slavery. So you're hearing this recurring thing of like, I'm a slave, I really am. And so at the Cercle Social, Paine develops a really close relationship with the Bonnevilles and their young family. Marguerite Bonneville was an acolyte of both the Gouge and Palm, and even Madame Roland joined that group. And they would have discussions about humanitarian projects, how to help widows, indigent, abused women. There was nothing, there were no social networks for any of that. There was a demand for divorce. There were discussions of creating a national system of public schools with members of the Cercle Social as teachers. And then they would sort of spread these messages through the Bonneville's newspapers. And a lot of this becomes the bedrock of Thomas Paine's agrarian justice. Agrarian justice is sort of this manifestation of, we can go to the next slide. I know you're bored with it. Next one. One more. No, one more. Okay, here we go. So there are two ways that Paine was greatly influenced. The first was Rights of Man. He deplores the laws, in this work, he deplores the laws of coverture. That's where women don't get anything. When you get married, you lose your identity. You have to get your, you can't vote according in this country, according to the SAVE Act. Here in America today, if you just cease to be a person. And he includes every child, male and female, specifically in a cry for universal education. He wrote that the condition of women in many countries is a state of oppression. So he's put his thoughts on paper. The second is agrarian justice, which is, I think, really probably, in my mind, one of the most important things he ever wrote. He automatically now is including women in any of his calls for social economic justice. Natural rights belong to all people, regardless of gender. He's become a proponent of the National Fund as an equalizer to offer a financial leg up to both men and women born without inherited wealth. He proposes the establishment of Social Security at age 50 for everyone, male and female. He champions gender-neutral theories of justice. He stopped just short of demanding suffrage for women because there wasn't universal suffrage for men yet, and so women just, of course, got pushed a little bit to the side. I'm gonna go back to the Paine Circle of Support, just go back, that. So just two other women that I want to, a few more other women I want to mention. Charlotte Lady Smith was a little flirtatious friend of his. They were just, you know how like Some guys you go to a party and you flirt a little bit with, but there was nothing really sexual there. But Paine spent 11 months in a French prison during the French Revolution, and he wrote poetry to her. He wrote these like love poems to her, and she would write back. He was in the castle in the air, and she was in the little corner of the world. And this was an important emotional connection for him. So sometimes his relationships with women were not about politics. They were about feelings. And she was one of the few people that he could share those feelings with. Elizabeth Monroe, wife of Jordan.
James.
James Monroe, I was right, yeah. When Paine got out of prison, he was in very, very poor health. And she nursed him back to health. And together, Paine and she sprung Lafayette's wife, who was also in prison. They concocted a plan to get her out of prison. So, he's involved with her. Ruth Barlow is an American. She was the wife of Joel Barlow, who was one of his closest friends. And she was a facilitator of all of the other women. They would congregate in her house, and he would draw them. And so he's really, really, really socializing with these people all the time. Kitty Few was a friend of his from Bordentown, New Jersey, and I like to think of her as Paine's little sister, so he was always offering little advice and all of those things. My own personal work is very much on Marguerite Bonneville, because when Paine came to America, first of all, when he got out of prison, recovered, he lived with the Bonnevilles for 5 years, almost 6 years. And her husband was arrested by Napoleon, and they took all of his printing equipment. She was penniless at that point, and Paine offered to take her to America as he was returning. This was in 1802. And he said, I'll take care of your family for as long as you need me to. And so she came to America and she took care of him. They were in and out of each other's lives until he died. She inherited his entire property here. And he had a very, very, very close relationship with her son. And I will happily talk to you about that until you're all 100 years old. So I will stop. I think there should be, is there one last slide? Maybe not. Conclusion? Anything? Yeah, there we go. That women's sacrifice were a vital part of the American Revolution. Yes, it can't be disputed. But the French Revolution was so different. The physicality of the French women, and they were really ready to kill people to get what they wanted. Their demands for equality, it made them a formidable political force, and Paine was really accepted by it. And they were his equals in debate. Also so important. And his constant exposure to these intellectual and social associations broadened his perspective. And it led him to expand the scope of what might be possible in the better world. He really, really believed that he could harness the power of government to make a better world, and to solve all of these age-old problems of poverty and despair, particularly as they affected women. And that's not changed. I feel like we almost need a new French Revolution here sometimes. But the most important part is he really learned to hear women's voices and to work alongside them as equals. So that is, I literally could write a book about any one of these relationships. It's been hard to distill it, but I will stop talking right now.
Any questions?
Please have questions.
Million questions. Sorry.
Just wondered, the picture of Bonneville was
That darker skin, is that just the artist?
No, it's an old engraving, and I colorized it, because she looked at it. So, Nicholas Bonneville, her husband's, cousin, did engravings, he did a beautiful engraving of Paine, for the cover of, one of the Bonneville's publications. And he lived in the same house with Paine and Marguerite, and they had 4 boys, one of whom became the reason we have the Bonneville Salt Flats, and the Pontiac Bonneville were named after one of her sons. And Paine was her youngest child's godfather. She had just given birth to Benjamin Bonneville, who is the Bonneville Salt Flat guy. He became a Civil War general, and a fur trader and an explorer. And then their last born child they named him Thomas Paine Bonneville. And so, and he was so fond of these little boys. He called Benjamin Bibby, and he refers to him in all of his letters, she's treating Bibby bad, or, he had opinions. He had opinions about things. I don't know that he would have made a good father, in the long run, but he really did care about the boys and providing for them. And, so that's why that engraving is funky looking. Ironically, there's this Francois Bonneville, the cousin, is doing all these engravings of every famous French revolutionary. I never made one of Nicholas Bonneville. There's no art of Nicholas Bonneville anywhere. If you see it, it's not him, it's his distant cousin. And so, I always thought it was interesting that they were using women as representation of this new France, and yet, they were still silencing them. So, the Thomas Paine Bonneville, the godson, Paine loved him. I mean, he really did love him. He tried to do all sorts of, extra things for him. Sent him to boarding school at age 8 up in Connecticut, to a Unitarian boarding school. It turned out that it was too much for poor Thomas Paine Bonneville, who joined the Navy during the War of 1812 and got kicked out in 1814 for insubordination. His commanding officer said no matter what he tried, nothing worked. And he's lost in the river. I can trace every one of the other 3 Bonneville children. I think he enlisted in the Army in a New York group when he was 20, and he stayed for 14 months and vanished. And I'm still trying to find him, if anybody wants to go digging, but there's this this huge impact of Paine as a father, or I like to say Paine as a grandfather. They make a big point about the importance of family in Paine's life, because that's another thing that nobody talks about. And he cared about these people and tried to do best for them in his own stubborn patriarchal way. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. I thought it was very fascinating, but curious to know, after Paine separated from his wife, did he have any romantic relationships?
Not that I can tell. I think he had these little flirtations, these poetic flirtations. It was funny, I was really excited. I've been working with a researcher in Paris, and I think Gary, you said to me that when he was arrested in Britain, in France, he was arrested in France, that was when Robespierre had come into power, although he wasn't really as bad as everybody says. We're doing all sorts of new things. There were worse people than Robespierre. But Gary said that somebody had told him that he had 2 prostitutes in his room with him on the night he was arrested. And I spent I don't know how much time trying to find out if that was true, but we got his arrest records. And I have all of his arrest records, and there is no mention of that, so I don't know.
It's in writing somewhere.
But we'll find. Yeah, we have to find that, because that really, I was so excited.
Ask Corinne Lucy. She's the one that dug it up.
Okay.
But
it's just we're so used to hearing him as, with Washington or Lafayette or Jefferson or, but you never hear them talking about these relationships with women. And they're hard to document because like I said, just the death throes of my dissertation at this point, which studies all of Paine's associational connections from when he was a pirate. I like to call him a pirate, he was a privateer, but I still will go to my grave saying that was what made Paine Paine, was that he left being a corset maker and went and lived on a pirate ship with 250 men. And he says that he never went 5 minutes without learning something new. And there's this whole ethos of pirate democracy. You could kill the captain. 250 men could easily overpower a captain. And so there was a degree of democracy on the ship in those days. You could also be thrown overboard. I just, it's these associations, and to look at these associations is so valuable to understanding him better as a person. I honestly will go to my grave saying that I don't think he would have evolved into this utopianist, this global humanist, if he didn't start to realize that half of the world's population was suffering. So, it's okay. Or we can talk about this all day.
No, I was gonna have questions on the other hand, so I won't feel like I'm holding you.
No.
I'm curious to know, based on your research, what do you think, are some of the biggest misconceptions that you think other historians have of Thomas Paine? And I'm asking this question from 2 perspectives. One is just generally, what do you think people get wrong about him? And then the other one being, what do you think they get wrong about him specifically about women?
Well, they don't talk about him in women. I probably have 20 biographies of Paine in my office right now. And I went into the index of each and every one of them, and there's you go to women, and there's see page 212, and that's it. So they're not writing about it. They're just not writing about it. There are 2 works that specifically speak about Paine and Mary Wollstonecraft. And that is literally it. In my university library, every journal, they're just not talking about it. I want to actually go in and dig a little deeper. But you find these things. The other thing that most historians get wrong about him, well, 2 things, that he actually was shy, a little shy. And everybody that met him in a social setting talked about how nice he was. And that was really interesting. I was finding these books from the early 1800s where people were introduced to him in social settings and they were like, oh my gosh, he was so nice. They didn't say that, but you know what I mean. He was so polite. There's a really, really good description of somebody. He was it's called an Irish peer on the continent. I can find the title if you would like it. And he described going to the Bonnevilles house, the printing establishment, and the boys were there. The 2 little boys were there, Baby and Baby Thomas. They were 4 and 5 years old at that point. And they're scampering all over everything. They're tugging on his pant legs, and he is absolutely good-natured with the boys. It was like nothing they could do to interact with him. And and here he is entertaining this person. And I don't know, maybe it's because I'm a grandmother, but it kind of resonated with me a little bit. That this was a person who would treat a small child with that much care and that much love. And you don't see that in anything that's written about him. Or that everybody that met him in a social setting commented about what a nice, unprepossessing person he was. So I don't know how he got his bad rep. Well, everybody hated his ideas, so it's easy to say, oh, he's an alcoholic, and and he's filthy and dirty. And so I'll get to you in 2 seconds. There was one guy who he had just gotten off a ship. He had been on a boat for 12 weeks. It took forever on his trip from the US to England. And the guy was like, oh, he was filthy. And I said, what do you expect? You know, you can't spend 12 weeks on one of these little wooden ships. We'll see how clean you are when you get there, how you had to parboil them before we could bring them into society. So, you know, it's stuff like that. I don't know if that helps at all.
No, I'm
I'm not trying to humanize him. You know, this is a flesh and blood person that had good ideas. But not a monster and not this just disgusting, snuff-ridden person, but a human being who cared about people and loved people. So, I don't know.
A comment and a question. Our British friends have discovered the divorce decree for Paine's divorce.
I have it.
It's a wonderful document.
It
It's at the
is.
Brighton Keep, it's at the Keep Brighton Home Archives, if anybody wants to go online and find it, it's amazing.
I think we have it on our website, FYI, right?
I'm not sure.
I sent it to you.
Yeah. You did.
The creed separation. Yeah. Yeah.
And my question is a Bonneville question. She was also his literary executor, and she actually wrote to Thomas Jefferson,
Yes.
asking about doing a Paine collection or edition.
Right.
Do you have any information on that? I know Jefferson kind of pushed her off and said, probably not a good idea at this point, but can you talk more about that?
That was self-defense on Jefferson's part. He had retired at that point and he just didn't want to have anybody bothering him or tarnishing his reputation at that point. He was done with politics. And that was what he said. He said, I have distanced myself from all of that. The big tragedy is that she had Paine's papers. She inherited all of Paine's papers. She was the executor of his estate. He left the boys, I think I did a calculation, close to, the farm and everything, worth about $350,000, which is, that's a nice sum of money.
in today's dollars?
In today's dollars, I think it was $18,000 in those days, dollars. And in one of the beacons, I have the Court of Chancery, some excerpts from the Court of Chancery in Albany. And she had to post a large bond, to ensure that the money would go to the boys. And, like I said, he really didn't care, but she had his papers, took them back to France. She went, Nicholas Bonneville finally got to America about 2 years after Paine died. He was released from was not allowed to leave the country, basically. And he finally made it to America, didn't really ever fit in. She actually changed her name to Eliza Bonneville and taught French. She lived on Barrack Street in New York. And then he came and taught English on Barrack Street in New York. And then they went back to France. They had renounced their Catholic faith, during the Revolution. They went back to France in, I think it was 1819, and they immediately got married in the Catholic Church, the Church of Saint-Sulpice. But he was ruined, all of this imprisonment and loss of family. He was just a ruined man at that point, but she stayed with him until he died. There's a wonderful description of her as like something out of a Walter Scott novel, this, formerly beautiful, wonderful woman just reduced to harrowedness. And so after her husband died, he was in America. Nicholas had vanished. Thomas Paine Bonneville had vanished. She had left one child behind when she came to America. Her second son, who was too frail to travel, he died while she was here. And she had one older son, Louis, who ended up coming to America and became a professor at Harvard. Another great story. They had become devotees of mesmerism. Do you know this, I'm gonna hypnotize you and turn you into a chicken, people would. Anyway, he left Harvard, he taught French at Harvard for 2 years. He got married, left Harvard, and started traveling the country doing these mesmerism demonstrations. And that's the oldest Bonneville. So a very interesting family.
We have a question from the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, you need the microphone.
I have to read it. It's from Francis.
She survived.
So Frances Chu, who's another one of our board members, was fascinated about Charlotte Smith.
Yeah.
She said Charlotte Smith is one of my favorite authors and part of her doctoral dissertation on the Gothic novel and radicalism. And Frances goes on, I think one of her characters in Desmond is based upon Paine. And then she asks, when did his acquaintance with Paine start? And is there correspondence between Smith and Paine?
The only correspondence between Smith and Paine that I know about are these poems, and I'm gonna see if I can try to find one. I have somewhere on this incredibly busy screen, or just bear with me for 2 seconds.
Should be what is love, no?
Yeah.
It's what is love.
I actually started this chapter with that poem and got into trouble with my dissertation committee immediately. You know? But it's beautiful, and the poetry between them is beautiful. But he also wrote a love poem to Ruth Barlow.
It's accidental reconciliation.
Yeah, good, thank you.
That's
Helping with these things.
We have a poetry expert
Poetry
about
expert
here.
Here it is, right here.
Got it. Yeah, but that's not the one I'm looking to.
Oh, what is love? I thought that's.
Bear with me, there was one particular passage that I thought was so incredibly beautiful, and it just really, I'm getting there. Almost there. This is it. But a storm that I felt not had risen and rolled while wrapped in a slumber I lay. Keep in mind that he's writing this in the prison. And it's funny, the French researchers are like, the French, the Luxembourg prison wasn't that bad. But I don't agree. I mean, I read enough to say that it was bad. They were dragging people out in the middle of the night and killing them. So I don't care if you could go to the library during the day. Anyway, but a storm that I felt not had risen and rolled while wrapped in a slumber I lay. And when I looked out in the morning, behold, my castle was carried away. It passed over rivers and valleys and groves. The world, it was all in my view. I thought of my friends, of their fates, of their loves, and often, full often, of you. And he had capitalized you. I thought that was the most beautiful part. Yeah.
There's one more on the chat. The person named Francie asks, reference was just made to a Varick Street, New York City residence. Do you know the address or time frame?
I do, but I will have to send it to you.
Okay.
There's a resource at the New York Public Library, and it's the New York City Directory. And some of us remember phone books. They didn't have phones, but they had an address directory, and you can find the exact street number on Barron Street where she lived. And I don't unfortunately have it on my laptop, but I'm happy to send it to you. So Bonneville was also the one who found places for Paine to live in his last year. She helped him move 6 times from one of these days, one of the next articles in the Beacon. I'm trying to make a map of all of the places Paine lived in the last year of his life. This is kept moving. And then they ended up sharing a house together in his last years and the last weeks, and she was with him when he died. And it's really interesting because the clergy kept trying to get him to recant. And they came, and like one particular guy came and he was a doctor, came at 12 midnight, woke him up, and started asking him if he wanted to reconsider his relationship with Jesus. And Paine said, go away, no. And he kept trying over and over and over again, to get him to recant. And it's really a testimony to the fact that he didn't. And it also made Paine, I talk about associations throughout his entire life, starting with the pirate ship. But in the end, he didn't want to be left alone. He made sure that he had people with him all the time. He said, do not leave me. And so there were witnesses to all of this. Will Hicks was with him all the time. And his next door neighbor, whose name I'm not going to remember right now, but just sat with him. Marguerite sat with him. So it's this connectivity, and it maybe, okay, this is my big takeaway from all of this. It's not just women, it's many, many other social groups really fortified him. And, it's really important to think about this when you think about him. Not as a, I don't know, I read something, I don't remember who it was, who said that he was essentially a loner, that we should think of Paine as a loner. And I am coming away with this thing, like, he was anything but a loner. He did not like being alone. And so, an important thing to remember, so. Okay, I think that's one.
So, early 1800s, in the context, I guess, of feminism, were there any mentions of the enslaved people?
Yes, that Gary can talk to about a lot.
The final article in the 6-volume set of the writings of Thomas Paine, which will be out in June. The last one in volume 6 is a letter signed "A Slave." And it was written by Thomas Paine, not actually written, somebody wrote it down because he was on his deathbed. And it was an attack on Jefferson for not freeing the slaves. He was a lifelong abolitionist. In order to hold the American forces together, he didn't publicly oppose slavery, but he did behind the scenes all the time, in letters and whatever. So,
By then, France said it was done.
It was done, Napoleon had come with his consulate, and that was the end of that.
Right.
There was a lot of trouble during the Haitian Rebellion.
Of course.
And it's interesting, when Marguerite Bonneville first got to America, she landed in Norfolk, Virginia. And at that point, 40% of the population in Norfolk was Black. And there was some degree of, equality a little bit, the draymen, the harbor jobs. But there was still a lot of talk about it not happening here. Norfolk, Virginia. If I survive my defense, you guys get to read about all of this, because I talk about all of this. What do you think?
What university were
I went to Arizona State University. I live on the West Coast, actually. And I started at ASU because I was living 4 hours away and I could drive there, pretty easily. I live in Los Angeles now, but I just stuck with them because I, at that time, liked the faculty. Not so fond anymore. But I actually have a really good quote from the letter to the slave. You can talk about it.
the letter to the slave is one of the most forceful abolitionist writing in American history. It's up on the bottom of that, debunking the myths. And in that section, Paine was the first American to demand reparations for all the slaves freed. So that gives you an idea of its abolitionist.
Besides us,
Yes.
just want to make that.
Yes. Sorry, you want to say something? Okay.
You've got time.
All right.
you want me to talk for another
But it didn't work.
Did you?
Yeah.
Still in, right?
Yeah. Some old guy dying on bed, that's what he wrote.
Hey, can I read this?
Yeah, sure.
He wrote, thus the axe and the halter, the rack and the wheel, the faggot and the crucifix are the infallible umpires, unerring oracles, the unchangeable standards of truth, the grand determiners of right and wrong. Treason and integrity, religion and superstition, reason and error go hand in hand in the world, and the tyrant and the priest of every pitiful territory arbitrarily decide by law which is truth and which is error. This is just the pitiful case of America, by her divisions into republican and federal tyrant and slave, priestcraft and lawcraft, day after day, upbraiding each other with lying and deceiving, corruption and error, ignorance and superstition, cheating and defrauding, sedition and knavery, blasphemy and cowardice, envy and talebearing, etc., etc. That's an excerpt from that letter. That's really powerful stuff. I mean, he was at that point like, I got weeks to live, I can just really.
And Jefferson never mentioned Paine again. So we just did away with that.
Was the Pennsylvania Constitution of '76 was also, Paine was involved in the slavery part of it?
The Whig Society wrote the Pennsylvania Constitution, and Paine was the leader of the Whig Society. So we definitely had a hand in it.
Which was the first attempt to get rid of slavery in the United States,
He
right?
didn't mention slavery because it had to be ratified from the population.
I thought there was an act in Pennsylvania, sorry.
Yes, that was in 1780.
Ah.
It wasn't in 1760.
Hmm.
It wrapped from that constitution in Pennsylvania. It only took 40 years to get rid of slavery.
I think my favorite, Marguerite Bonneville did keep a record of what was happening in Paine's last days. And she was with him when one of the doctors came to see him at the very end of his life. And she wrote, he now grew weaker and weaker very fast. A very few days before his death, Dr. Romaine said to me, I don't think he can live till night. Paine, hearing someone speak, opened his eyes and says, it is you, doctor? What news? Mr. Such, none is gone to France on such business. He will do nothing here, said Paine. Your belly diminishes, said the doctor, and yours augments, said Paine. I love that he could crack a joke, on his deathbed. I think that says a lot about him too. But it's nice that I have Marguerite's memoirs of these last few days.
How old was you in the past?
72,
72?
72, 73, so something like that.
From 1737 all the way up to
9, don't make me do that, Gary.
So
I'm carrying the names of every French revolutionary in my head right now, don't make me add.
I was wondering if you could talk to the impact of these, particularly the French feminists. It seems like to me that there was a gap between, say, 1800 and the French Revolution, and then the real kickoff of sort of successes for feminists.
Oh, long time, I mean,
Yeah.
really.
Right. So I mean, what was their impact in the?
That's a really good question, and I haven't really thought about that. I was so focused on the revolution and who was getting executed, and that there was at least equality at the guillotine for women. Olympe de Gouges was the first to be beheaded. Madame Roland 3 days later. Palm was thrown in jail for 3 years and came out crazy. And so Sophie de Gruchet had to go into hiding. She was a very skilled miniaturist, and so she just moved into the lowest slum she could find and hid out there for several years. So they all kind of scattered. It's better than being executed. And it had to be hard for everybody, for Paine to know that, his friends were getting executed, one after another. Rousseau was one of the first to go because he was sort of the head of the political party that although he wasn't actually a part of, but he kind of hung out with them and affiliated with them. He had his own opinions about things. When you think about this thing, and he wrote one prison memoir later on, he doesn't really write a whole lot about this. I mean, he does write about his time in prison. But there was one story I stumbled upon from one of his roommates. And they were.
Joy, keep your microphone.
Oh, sorry. Is it working? It's not lit up.
Could you use carrots?
I got it. So, you have to picture this. He's been in prison for a really long time. And he's made friends, and they are up on there's like a higher floor. They were up on a higher floor. I don't know what the reason was. He was with his friend and his friend's brother, who was also in this prison. And the guards came up and literally took the friend's brother and threw him out of a fourth-story window in front of Paine and this Belgian guy who he had become friends with. You know, and these sort of things, you know, they just get you for a while. You know, so and it's a very interesting time in history, you know, in writing history right now, because there's this movement amongst French historians to say that the terror wasn't that bad, you know, and dealing with that name, you know. And that you shouldn't even call it the terror, because it wasn't really all that bad when you compare it to America's Civil War, or, you know, like any of Napoleon's intrusions, or Stalin, or, you know, and it was just like, you know, so they indiscriminately killed 20-30,000 people, but what's 20-30,000 people? So, what?
You're exaggerating.
I am not exaggerating. I swear to God, I've been working with a French historian for 4 years now, and so I'm getting all of this sentiment about how we over dramatize the whole thing. You know, and I think I mentioned that Robespierre wasn't as bad as everybody says he was. That there were other people that were worse, and so
That's true.
yeah, and so
That's true.
I know.
And he wasn't that bad. He started out with Ethan. The truth about the French Revolution was that it's fuzzy as the American Revolution still is, that we have to straighten out. But the two French who were on our board, editorial board of the collective writings, and they have a slightly different picture. And they spent the last 25, 30 years in digging up details of the French Revolution. They came out with a different story. For example, they had a number of 13,000 total people that were executed, as opposed to 30,000 alone in the ship hold in New York Harbor, where the British sent all the captured Americans, and they let them stay in the hold until they all died. That was twice as much as what was killed in French. So, yes, there was atrocities in every revolution, but the British went overboard, and it's in the English language. It's stuck to historians that it was so horrible, the French Revolution. And Paine didn't think that was that bad. I mean, he said it was bad. They went off the rails. He tried to get it back. He gave a speech to the French Assembly when he got out of prison. And there was a second revolution that no one talks about, led by Babeuf. Babeuf was the organization.
Yeah.
And they wanted to establish the 1793 Constitution that was written for France. And Paine brought over the Constitution in essence to the French. And that 93 Constitution was very democratic. And that's one of the main reasons that the landowners forcefully pushed their way into the government again and took over a lot of things in 95. And they enacted their own constitution, which was worse than the United States Constitution, if you can imagine. So things weren't good in France in the 1790s. That's my 2 cents. Anybody else? Got some? What was Paine? He was buried right next to it. Was buried. It didn't last. Our friends in Bonneville, they moved him to.
Now I'm gonna find this part. It's such a great story, seriously.
Go ahead.
Such a great story.
And then maybe we should wrap up.
I
It's
know.
3:30.
I'm sorry.
We're losing our Zoom audience.
Oh, that's okay, it's okay. They don't deserve to hear all of this.
Well, I can give it a short thing.
I'm just trying to find this little thing, because it's
All right.
so great.
He was buried
Here.
underneath, go ahead. No, you don't have it. Right next to where it is, the monument right there. Yes. It's right on the right side of it. In the middle of the road was the grave. Oh, but in 1719, Cotton came over, dug up the whole boat, put it on a ship, and brought it back to England. And then the boats were lost. in time, but it took 20.
He's buried in a parking lot in,
Yeah, pretty much.
No,
so that is what
it was, well, it was probably sent in garbage. Yeah, but several pieces were taken, the skull, the brainstem, which is underneath the statue. That's the only part left, except for a few pieces of hair, which is in our collection over at Iona.
Which are still dark.
So we could still clone them, is what you're saying.
And we should. That's a good note to end on. Yeah.
So that's a book in itself. It's been written about.
His son in the Declaration of Independence, who was buried in the Bronx, and saying that in the song Bronx, I'm sure about it. Who was? I'm trying to remember the name.
I don't know, but it's
There,
there.
it's one of the churches. Says the saying that is very recent actually of this church. I'm saying, and then
We're
we're
not talking about Paine, though.
the same not wrong, I'm sorry.
We're not talking about Paine now.
No, I was just curious, you know.
I have one good last story, if you wanna hear about that I forgot to talk about, and it'll be really quick, I know, and those people are not gonna learn this great tidbit. Paine had
Use the microphone.
sorry. Paine had a working relationship with a guy named James Cheatham, who was a newspaper man, the American Citizen. And they worked companionably together, they had a lot in common. Cheatham was an English hat maker, I think, who came to America and started polemicizing. They were friends, and then they got into a dispute about something, and then Cheatham turned against Paine. This is when he's returned from France. And he starts this innuendo that Madame Bonneville and Paine were having an affair, and that Thomas Paine Bonneville was Thomas Paine's love child. And he printed this, and Madame Bonneville was not having any of it. And so she sued him, and there was a trial, she won in the end, good for her. She hired this flamboyant Irish lawyer named William Sansom. And, he was like, just imagine the brutality, the burning horrors in her heart. And I laughed when I read his whole thing, but she won. But because Paine was a deist, and the judge was not, he was an ardent Christian follower, he only awarded her $150. But the notion of this trial followed her the rest of her life. She ended up living in St. Louis, where her young Benjamin Bonneville was living, and they reported in the newspapers, that she had been an adulteress. She was like 65 years old at this point, and we're still talking about this. So unfair to everybody. Thank you all really for coming.